Welcome back to One American Baseball Podcast. You're joining Chris and I for episode 32, and it was a rough week for my Cincinnati Reds, and you'll hear that when we get into our weekly takeaways. Chris, I think it's a lot of the same up in Cleveland as far as how we're feeling about our seasons. Um, and then we're going to talk some fantasy baseball after we do our weekly takeaways. Chris and I are facing each other in the first round of the playoffs, so we're going to dig into that a little bit. But Chris, how are you doing today?
I'm good. The Guardians have gone 4-3 since we last checked in with all the lovely listeners of the podcast, and that would be a pretty decent week. However, the Guardians kind of shot themselves in the foot with how they have played in the last month or so. So unfortunately, it wasn't good enough for the Guardians playing good baseball, but not perfect baseball, and I'll kind of get into that here. Um, but yeah, the Guardians, as I kind of said last week, they needed to play perfect baseball. They really have room for maybe 5 to 10 losses the rest of the season. They're sitting at 68 and 68, and I think that the third wild card team will probably lose in the range of 75 to 77 or 78 games or whatever. So it's the Guardians have to play really, really clean baseball the rest of the season, and they don't have a super easy schedule by any means. They have a lot of division games. They definitely have a lot of winnable games in their schedule, but they do play the Tigers, I believe, for 6 more games in the month of September. They have the Twins and the White Sox still to play as well. I think they have another series against the Royals. They're uh they're in Tampa, I think, at the end of this week. So it's not going to be easy series by any means, but the Guardians are pretty much done with the interleague play for basically the whole season. So it's really down to a lot of meaningful games from here on out. And the Guardians kind of surprised me with winning 2 series this past week. They got blown out against the Rays but way back in game one of that series. I think we were recording mid-game when that was happening. But yeah, the Guardians got blown out 9-0, and then they won two pretty convincing games the next 2 days. They played some good baseball against the Rays. I'll give them credit. And then, they won the first 2 games in the Mariners series as well. That game one series against the Mariners was actually amazing. I was checking in with that game. Just I wasn't doing anything that night, so I figure I'll watch it on my laptop or something, or like I'll follow along with the score. And I saw that they were down 4-0 after 1 inning, so I was like, yeah, I'll just do something else with my time. I'm not gonna waste my time tonight. But I was following along with the score, and they managed to erase a 4-run deficit. And then I checked back in the seventh inning. I started watching the game again, and I was like, wait a second, this is actually a good ball game. And then I saw the whole comeback, but they were celebrating the 95 Indians team that night, which that 95 Indians team erased so many deficits, kind of like they did in that one random late August game where they were kind of out of the playoffs, but not really, and against a team they were competing directly against. And it was a rematch of the ALCS from 95, which was also pretty interesting. But that was maybe the most exciting game of the year for the Guardians. I mean, they haven't had a win that was that exciting in quite a while, and they frankly had no business winning that game. Um, a lot of that was because of Nolan Jones, and he's admitted himself he hasn't had a very good season. But he's recently found his power stroke. He hit a home run in Game 3 against the Rays, and then he hit another home run in Game 1 of that Mariners series, and then he had a double in the ninth inning, which then he came around to score the I believe it was a tying run, and then Stephen Kwan knocked Rocchio in for a sacrifice fly to end the game. But man, that was a really fun game to watch, for sure. And then going into um and then the rest of the Mariners series, they won the second game. That was a pretty good game overall. Kind of uneventful game, but it was a good win nonetheless. And then game 3. against the Mariners was pretty brutal. They Tanner Bybee had a really good outing. He just gave up a 2-run homer to Randy Rosarena, I believe it was, and then they were tied through 7 innings and they almost got out of the inning, except, Julio Rodriguez, I think, was the runner and he legged out an infield single, which got 2 runs home. And it was a bang bang play. There weren't enough camera angles to really overturn the safe call. So the Guardians kind of got screwed over there with, I think the call would have stood either way, that it was, if it was if Rodriguez was called out there, I think it would have stood, and there wasn't enough evidence to overturn the safe call. So very unfortunate on the Guardians' part. And then Andres Munoz, he wasn't going to blow 2 saves in the same series, so that was a really unfortunate loss for the Guardians yesterday. And then today in Boston, they lost 6-4. There was a really wacky home run. I think Trevor Story was the one who hit it. But there was a really wacky home run where Kenzie Noel was playing right field and he almost robbed Story of a home run, and then it ricocheted out of his glove onto the foul pole, and then it ricocheted out of bounds from there in the seats. So that was really weird, but yeah, that would have been a home run in one park, I would imagine. I mean, that was right in the corners, hit probably about 310 feet. So in 29 out of 30 ballparks, that would have been out, and the Guardians would have gone out of that inning without giving up any runs. So that today was another kind of unfortunate loss to Boston, and it was kind of frustrating because the Guardians worked like a 35 pitch inning to try to get Brian Bayo out of there, and they didn't really build off that momentum. Bayo was through 3 innings, I think he was around 70 or 80 pitches, and they worked a bunch of walks against him. Bayo he wasn't necessarily super wild, but he was missing within the zone, and the umpire had a really tight strike zone today. So the Guardians kind of took advantage of that and scraped across 3 runs in that third inning, but they didn't do anything the rest of the game. Kyle Manzardo had a solo homer to bring it to 6-4, but they couldn't get any momentum working off that 3-run inning, which I thought was pretty frustrating. And then they weren't going to do anything off Aroldis Chapman in the ninth inning. I think Chapman has retired something like 44 batters in a row. Um, Pretty ridiculous stuff. So I mean, he had like a 5 pitch inning to get the save. It wasn't even really a contest. So but at this point in the season, every loss just kind of hurts, whether it's, a close loss, kind of like today, where there was, one play that it came down to. There was a loss against the Mariners yesterday where it was really just one play that it came down to. Those losses really hurt, as well as just any regular loss, like a blowout or I don't know, just the game that the Guardians kind of lost fair and square. Those losses just hurt at this point in the season, just with, how, because there's so many games that you can look at from this season overall from the Guardians standpoint. And, the season it'd be so much of a different outlook right now if the Guardians had just taken care of business in the games that they were supposed to win in July and August. So it really hurts right now with every loss. And like I said, they can only lose a handful of games the rest of the season. So they've put themselves in a tough spot. And I think that really, like, kind of looking to 2026 is I'm kind of beyond the accepting stage of the Guardians not making the playoffs. I kind of accepted it last week, but with the Guardians playing good baseball, it makes it really, really hard to not still be emotionally invested in this team, which I think is a little unfortunate. I would rather the Guardians just pick a lane and stick to it, but that's just, that's the Guardians can never be a bad team, which that's kind of the double-edged sword of this organization is, they put together a competitive team almost every year, but on the worst years, they still have a chance of making the playoffs most of the time. And then, they like the Guardians this year, they just shot themselves in the foot too many times and they kind of play themselves out of it. But there were some interesting roster moves made this week. I'm sure everybody has heard of this by now, but Carlos Santana got released on Thursday and he got picked up by the Cubs yesterday. So I'm not sure if he made his debut with the Cubs yet. He might have made his debut today, but Santana's now a Chicago Cub. Makes him pretty good for immaculate grid. I mean, he's already a good grid guy, but the Cubs are a new team that he's never played on. So, but it was kind of a mutual decision. I called him a few weeks ago on the podcast that Santana was going to get DFA'd. And a release actually, he got outright released by the Guardians. And it makes sense because when you get DFA'd, you're put on outright waivers, and there's a certain order that each team is put in where they can claim you off of waivers. And then if you don't get claimed by any team, then you're assigned to the AAA affiliate of whatever team you get DFA'd from. And at this point in Santana's career, he's a borderline Hall of Famer, and he doesn't really have any business being in the minor leagues. So getting another shot with another team at the major league level kind of made the most sense for him. And the Cubs are making a big playoff push. I believe they're sitting at the fourth seed in the NL. So um, it makes sense for a team like the Cubs to pick him up as kind of a depth bat, locker room guy, sort of like an Austin Hedges type with the Rangers a couple years ago, except can provide a little bit more value at the plate and defensively. But um, another roster move, the September call-ups, which I always think those are super interesting as a little bit more of a prospect nerd, but George Valera got called up finally. This is a pretty big deal for um, our fans who keep up with prospects a lot. George Valera was, a very highly regarded prospect. He really should have made his debut a couple years ago, but with how many injuries he's endured, the talent's always been there, but he's just dealt with so many injuries. He spent parts of 7 seasons in the minor leagues. He signed as an international free agent at 16 years old. So he's only 24 years old, despite being around professional baseball for 7 seasons. But um, he finally hit a healthy streak in AAA, and he got hot the last couple weeks, and he hit for the cycle last week. So, the Guardians thought it would make the most sense to finally give Valera a shot at the big leagues. Today he looked pretty decent at the plate. He walked and was a big part of that 3-run inning. Um, and he DH'd. It's really hard as a uh, a guy making their big league debut to take 4 straight pitches to walk. So I definitely commend Valera for having that kind of patience at the plate. And he struck out and grounded out today. So, not a terrible day. Yeah, pretty average debut, but we'll see how he does this last month of the season. I don't really think that Valera has much of a role on this team going forward. He's another kind of right field DH guy, and we have 1,000 of those at this point. That you know, CJ Kapis kind of looks like the guy with the higher ceiling at this point. And with Valera's health history, I just don't really see Valera being a part of this organization going forward. So I could see if George Valera has a hot month of baseball, I could see him being a potential trade piece. Um, so we'll definitely see how that goes. I'm definitely going to be paying a pretty close attention to George Valera this season. Zach Kent was another guy that got called up. He's been in the big leagues a couple times. He's kind of a quad A guy at this point. He's 27 years old. He doesn't really move the needle. He's a relief pitcher, just kind of a depth guy. So nothing really too exciting with Zach Kent. And then finally, Big Christmas got called back up to the big leagues. He's putting up, I think it's a 397 OPS this year, which is really bad, obviously. He put up an 831 OPS in Columbus in 61 games and hit 12 home runs. So he's put up a decent stat line in Columbus, but the AAA is just such a big difference between, the big leagues and stuff. So um, I think at this point, John Kenzie Noel is getting kind of one last shot in a Guardians uniform, and who knows what's going to happen the rest of his career. But I definitely see his career really mirroring Oscar Gonzalez at this point. Oscar Gonzalez is playing, I think, in Korea. We looked at it I think earlier this week, and I think he's playing in Korea. But yeah, he's not doing great over there. So um but that's all I have on the Guardians front. So it'd be interesting to see these kind of newish guys and see how a lot of these guys do going down the stretch for next year. So
Yeah, I definitely echo a lot of your sentiments with the Guardians as far as the Reds go too. You know, they pretty much have to play perfect, same as the Guardians. Every loss is going to hurt at this point, and they realistically can't lose many more. Um, I think I'm about a week behind on the accepting that the season's probably done for, especially after a really exciting win today. Um, sort of reeled me back in a little bit. So we'll see how this week goes. And like you mentioned with the Guardian schedule, I mean, it's a lot of the same for the Reds. I feel like, we've got the Blue Jays. Played them today and um, ended up winning that one. And then we got the Mets this weekend. And so, we're still only 4 games out. The Mets are playing the Tigers. The Tigers couldn't get it done today, but if we can take one more against the Blue Jays and the Mets can lose the next two against the Tigers, you're 3 games back going into a weekend series against the Mets. And that has the chance to really break my heart or really pull me right back in. And then it's the Athletics and Padres, and I think the Dodgers again after that. Maybe not the Dodgers. Um, I think it's the Athletics and the Padres, and then we got to run the NL Central gauntlet after that to finish out the season. So um, playing a lot of really good teams, playing a few teams that you should beat, and the Pirates and the Cardinals and the Athletics, and those are games that have killed the Reds for most of this season. So it'll be interesting to see. I think this weekend's definitely gonna tell me where I need to sit with this team heading into our conversation next week. But for our conversation this week, first thing I want to touch on is, uh, it was a rough week for Reds baseball last week. They went 1-5 against the Dodgers and the Cardinals, and sort of played themselves out of the playoffs. It felt like, and there were a lot of people. Um, in and around the Reds sort of fandom online that were calling for Tito to be fired, which I think this is a frustrating franchise. And a lot of things, I mean, for the 24 years of my life and the 6 years before that, not much has really gone right for this franchise. And so, there's a lot of frustration in Cincinnati, but calling for Tito to be fired it shows how dumb fan bases can be sometimes because we care so much about winning and we care so much about these teams. And usually the first person that you want to blame is your coach or your manager or whatever. Um, but calling for Terry Francona to be fired is really pretty stupid from this fan base. He hasn't been perfect, and sure, he wants to play small ball with his teams, but small ball can work. We saw that with the Guardians when he was there. Um, you're seeing it with the Brewers this year, really. They're a small ball team and they're the best team in the MLB. Same with the Blue Jays who we're playing right now. It's good defense, it's speed, and it's getting your base hits. Now those teams can also hit home runs. The Blue Jays and the Brewers can hit home runs when they need to. That's the one thing where the Reds fall short, but you can't blame Tito for the fact that the front office won't go out and get a bopper. That's roster mismanagement stuff, and that's a front office thing, not a Tito thing. Um, I think it's impressive that he's been given a pretty rough roster to work with at times. Reese Hines was getting extended runs in the big leagues. Blake Dunn was on our opening day roster. People don't want to talk about that, but Blake Dunn was on our opening day roster. We had Tyler Callahan starting there until he went down with that unfortunate broken arm. But, he's taken a team that really has this is a 500 team at best, I think, under a lot of managers. And he's taken this roster and he's kept them in the race until the last month of the season. And I think that speaks to how good of a manager he is, even if you want to complain about, oh, we laid down a bunt when we shouldn't have, or oh, we're not stealing enough. I think it's silly to call for him to be fired. It's also his first year with the team. I mean, you know, he's coming in after the David Bell regime, and the David Bell regime was a lot of they weren't really focused on stringing hits together. They were much more home run oriented. Um, and he's brought in an entirely new hitting staff, basically. The pitching staff has remained largely the same, but he's brought in a new hitting coach and a lot of new bench coaches, and he's got a different philosophy than David Bell did. And so this roster is also learning how to play the style of baseball that Tito wants them to play. And so, you can't blame him for some grow. I mean, you can blame him for growing pains, I guess, if you wanted to, and but I think it would be silly to. We've seen that Tito knows what he's doing. We've seen it in Boston and we've seen it in Cleveland. So to, blame him for maybe some growing pains, I think is silly. You have to, I think going into this season, Reds fans needed to understand that it was going to take time to learn how Tito wanted this team to play and for them to actually play like it. Um, and I think we've sort of lost track of that as the season has gone on because he kept us in it for so long. Um, and then the losing stretch came, and everyone sort of turned on him, which I think is ridiculous. It's just I'll close with this. It's ludicrous to suggest that a Hall of Fame manager needs to be fired 1 year into a deal because he couldn't manage a quad A lineup to a playoff spot, basically. I think and I get there's a lot of frustration. I'm frustrated too, but to call for Terry Francona to be fired at this point is um it makes you seem like you know nothing about baseball, basically.
Yeah, if I can interject on the
Yeah.
Tito thing, I want to kind of remind people that the Indians barely snuck into the playoffs in 2013 in Tito's first year as a
Hmm.
manager, and they had a pretty similar rostering quality to the Reds this year. They just got a few more things to go their way, and
Right.
I think the American League was relatively weak that year. Um, and then 2014 and 2015, the Indians definitely did not make the playoffs in 14. That was
Hmm.
Tito's second year. And then 15, they either got knocked out in the wild card game. I think they got knocked out in the wild card game. And then 16, people forget that in 16 they barely made the playoffs this year. And then they just got really hot.
Right.
17 was really the first year where the Indians were a legitimate powerhouse, 4 years
Mm.
into Tito's manager stint. So, um, and that was also, the Indians and Guardians have had a much better front office as
Right.
well. So it's not the managers have a lot of impact on the day-to-day kind of vibes of the team and the other than that, I mean, the roster construction is all front office people. So
Definitely. Yeah. And even now, Tito's known for like some pretty good September runs. And I saw something today in his first season as a manager in September with his various teams in September. He went like 19 and 11 or something with the Phillies. And then with the Red Sox and the Indians at the time, he went like 21 and 6 with both of those teams. So it's not out of the realm of possibilities that this team gets really hot in September and blows past the Mets. I don't think it's likely, but it's not out of the realm of possibilities. And then, if this team does get hot in September, are you still going to be calling for him to be fired? No, you're not. So, it's all expectation, and I just think it's silly to call for him to be fired at this point. That being said, I have sort of turned my focus to 2026. Um, the Mets swept the Phillies last week, which I thought was never going to happen. And uh, they went in and got it done somehow, or they were at home, so the Phillies, um, you know, went to Citi Field and got it put on them there. And then the Reds were also swept by the Dodgers, so sweepless streak is over, so can't watch for that anymore this season. So those two sweeps happening at the same time. Those were both Monday to Wednesday series. Sort of felt like it put this season on ice. So what went wrong this year? I think the offensive game planning seemed lacking at times. there were a lot of times where we were letting pitchers off the hook. Even today, it was a game we won, but Ellie led off an inning with a triple, and then he didn't score. That's just, you can't let that happen. You have to. There were a lot of leadoff doubles that didn't come around to score this season, or you know, bases loaded, one out, and we couldn't get a run home. And it's just, you do that so many times in a season, and eventually it's, you're going to have to pay for it. And the Reds have done that a lot this season, I think. And then, another thing is there's been some questionable bunts laid down. There was one against the Cardinals on Saturday where we had runners on first and second. We were down 2 runs, and we had our backup catcher lay down a bunt. And granted, he's not a good hitter by any means, but he's probably an even worse bunter. Laid down a bunt, and the lead runner was thrown out at third. So, didn't really work out for us. Probably shouldn't have bunted there. There was a point in the Dodgers series where we had first and second, Noelvi Marte up at the plate, and he laid down a bunt that also, or he popped up the bunt, and Matt McLean was doubled off at second. So, um, gotta gotta reel that in, I think, a little bit. And it's just been a lot of letting pitchers get off the hook, and I don't know if that's guys trying to do too much, or guys trying to do too little, or guys being a little impatient at the plate. I'm not really sure what the issue is there, but I think that's definitely part of the problem. Um, and with this being Tito's first year, this is also still a really young roster. Ellie's 23, Matt McLean's 25. You know, Gavin Lux is relatively young. I mean, he's been around for a while and he's been on some playoff teams, but he's young. Um, our pitching staff is really young. Hunter Green's only 25. Nick Lodolo and Andrew Abbott, I believe, are right around that age. Um, you know, this is a super young roster who's not really experienced a playoff push. So when the lights got bright and push came to shove, they sort of crumbled under the pressure a little bit. Simple as that. And I think that's to be expected with a young roster who has never really experienced the weight and gravity of a playoff push, but that's just the truth. They couldn't handle it this year. They've lost 7 of their last 10, and there were a lot of costly errors in this last week and a half. They're sixth in the MLB in errors. They've got to clean that up, and that comes with maturity and age more than anything. But you know they they couldn't get it done. I think that's partially because of how young this roster was, and how inexperienced they are with the playoff push. Another thing that's really hurt this year is Matt McLean has taken a step backwards. Um, he's at this point he's not going to be sent down no matter how much people call for it. He put up 3.6 WAR in 89 games in 2023, and he had an OPS plus of 127. In 2023, he was top three in a lot of major offensive categories for rookies. And he was off all of last year with that shoulder surgery that he had to get after the injury in spring training. And so this year he's put up negative zero point 0.2 WAR in 122 games, and he has an OPS plus of 74. Um, he's started to find it a little bit these last couple games. He had um, a couple home runs in the Cardinals series, took a couple good walks, took a walk today, had a good base hit the other way in the ninth inning, and ended up scoring the tying run. But you hope that this step back is because of the shoulder surgery and missing an entire year of baseball. You hope that Matt McLean is, he doesn't have to be the guy that he was in 2023. I think that's expecting a little bit too much from him, but you hope he's not a negative WAR player, and a guy who's gonna have a below league average OPS plus. You need him to be somewhere in the middle of these two seasons, and hopefully he's able to stay healthy the rest of this year, stay healthy going into next year, and then he's that player that we need him to be. Because missing a year of baseball is really tough. Joey Votto missed extended time with shoulder surgery towards the end of his career and wasn't the same player really. So these things Missing a year of baseball isn't easy. Probably will take about a year to get your timing back and everything and get back into the swing of things. So I hope that's what we're seeing now. If Matt McClain can get hot this year, maybe the Reds do make the playoff push, but um, you know, at the very least, you need him to be closer to the player he was in 2023 next year, and not the player he's been this year. There's this team hasn't had enough offensive value from from their lineup. They have three players with more than one offensive WAR per Baseball Reference. You compare that to the Mets, who have nine players with one or more offensive WAR. So, like I mentioned when I was talking about Tito, this is not a great lineup. There are not a lot of great hitters on this team, and that's just part of the problem with this lineup. They need to add some bats in the offseason, and I don't know if they're going to do that, but you know, there's a very clear issue here, and I think that it needs to be addressed by the front office. I think the last thing that's hurt them is the refusal to call up players. The Mets called up top prospects to make a difference before rosters were expanded to help them make the push. We saw Jonah Tong and Noah McLean both get called up to help out a Mets pitching staff that's really been struggling recently. And the Reds front office refused to do anything similar to that. This past week and a half when the Reds were really struggling offensively, they kept Sal Stewart in AAA and waited 2 weeks to call him up until rosters got expanded. Why he couldn't have been called up, um, at the start of the Angels series. I get that maybe you don't want to send anyone down or option anyone, but Santiago Espinal is providing so little value to this team. He's just sitting on the bench basically as a late game defensive replacement. You could do this if you could do the same thing with Matt McClain if you call Sal Stewart up, um, keep Sal in the game for 6 innings to help you on offense, and bring Matt McClain in as a late game defensive sub. I think it was gross roster mismanagement by this front office to let him sit in AAA while the Reds offense was struggling so mightily. And sure, maybe he comes up to the MLB level and he can't hit like he's hitting in AAA, but you've at least got to try at this point in the season if you want to be serious about making the playoffs. And it just feels like this front office is never serious about making the playoffs. It feels like they're content being an 82 win team that, will fill the ballpark on the weekends and generate a lot of revenue for the ownership. But when push comes to shove, they're not serious about contending. Um, and, I don't know if I expect them to ever be serious about contending with this front office and this ownership group. Um, I don't think the Castellinis care about winning. I think they care about lining their pockets. I think that's incredibly obvious to anyone who follows Reds baseball. And I'm tired of it. I think a lot of Cincinnati's tired of it. They've taken what was a proud baseball city. I mean, Pete Rose called it the capital of baseball. It was a team that was successful in the 70s, was successful in the 90s, had some success there in the early 2010s, and they've run this franchise into the ground. Their refusal to spend money, their refusal to extend players, um, it's really rough to see at times. And I didn't want it to get this depressing, but you know, that's just how I feel about this ownership group. I'm not going to make a difference. These billionaires don't care about a podcast with 7 listeners and how I feel about them, but I really, the Castellinis don't care about winning. They don't want this team to win, unless it's, not at the cost of the bottom line. And they need to go, frankly, if the Reds ever want to be a successful franchise again. And hopefully they're gone before I'm gone, and a new ownership group comes in and uh, you know spends a little bit of dough to help this team win. But this ownership group won't do that. Um, Now moving into how the team looks next year, I think the roster probably is going to remain unchanged for the most part, aside from the bullpen. The bullpen has a lot of expiring deals and moving pieces, so a lot of those guys will probably be gone. We might re-sign a couple of them, but the bullpen will be the biggest change, I think, going into next year. Now, infielders for next year, you've got Spencer Steer, Matt McClain, Ellie De La Cruz, Cabrian Hayes, Gavin Lux. has one more year in his deal, so he'll be here. Sal Stewart, and then Jose Trevino and Tyler Stevenson. Now, Stevenson's interesting because he's likely not going to sign a contract extension with the Reds if it doesn't get done this offseason. We might see him traded this offseason or, traded at the deadline next year at the very latest. But I think he probably remains on this team until the trade deadline next year if he doesn't sign an extension. Um, Outfielders, you'll have Noelvi Marte, TJ Friedel. Hector Rodriguez is a guy who's in AAA right now. I think he'll probably make the roster coming out of spring next year, and Will Benson. And then you've got one of Austin Hayes or Miguel Andujar. They're both free agents this winter. I would hope one of them gets re-signed. I would like to see Andujar re-signed personally. Um, I think he's just a better bat and a better bet than Austin Hayes is at this point. He doesn't provide the same defensive value, but I think he's a better option for the offense. Your starters will be Hunter Green, Andrew Abbott, Nick Lodolo, Chase Burns, Rhett Lauder, and probably Brady Singer. Brady Singer will be somewhere in there. I think he's got a year left on his deal after this year. So it'll be interesting to see what they do with Brady Singer. Will they move him to the bullpen as a long relief guy, or do they trade him? Because they have those five are definitely going to be your starters next year, I think, barring any sort of injury. And then the bullpen, like I said, it's hard to say. A lot of expiring deals. Emilio Pagan is gone. Nick Martinez is gone. Zach Littell is gone. Tony Santiano will still be here. Um, I think Scott Barlow will still be here, I believe. But, there's going to be a lot of moving pieces in the bullpen. Um, and that's going to be the most interesting part of the offseason, I think. Like I said, Austin Hayes and Miguel Andujar are both free agents, so I think they re-sign one of those guys. And I would love to see them add a genuine power bat, but like I said, this ownership group doesn't spend money, and you're not going to get a power bat by being frugal. It's just not going to happen. Those guys know what they're worth in today's game of baseball, and they're not going to sign for a deal that they feel like they're not worth for a team that hasn't made the playoffs in a real season since 2014 or 2013. So, um, likely won't see that. I would like to see it, but it won't happen. I don't think. It'll probably be another bottom of the barrel guy that they hope can find his form, sort of like an Austin Hayes this year. Um, and Austin Hayes has been all right for this team. He hasn't impressed me that much, but he's been a decent little piece. So that's just what I expect them to do. Um, they need to focus on getting Noelvi Marte more comfortable in the outfield this offseason and cleaning up the defense in general. Um, Noelvi he was an infielder who got moved to right field. I don't blame him for any of his misplays out in the outfield. But he needs to take the time this offseason and the spring training to become a bona fide right fielder because he has the arm to do it. He has the athleticism to do it, and he's a bat that you want in your lineup. So he needs to, work on getting his reads right, and I think he'll be able to do that this offseason. And then, I wonder if it's time to consider moving Ellie to the outfield. He's cost his team quite a few games with his errors at shortstop, and it gets to a point where it's inexcusable. Um, and I frankly, I reached that point this week where I was tired of seeing it, and um, I think a change needs to be made. He leads the MLB in errors again, and they always seem to come at the worst times. There was the game against the Brewers that we were at where it was a throwing error by him that lost him the game. A throwing error by him cost him the game this week against St. Louis. Now, granted, that's probably a ball that Spencer Steer should have picked, but um, you know, when you're a superstar and you lead the MLB in errors, the spotlight's always going to be on you. It's not going to be, oh, my first baseman didn't pick a ball that I threw in the dirt. That's the spotlight's on you for that. Um, TJ Friedel's getting up there in age. He'll be 30 next year. There's some talk about whether or not he'll be moved this offseason. And, if he gets moved, I think you move Ellie to center field. He's got the speed to do it. We saw the Pirates do it with O'Neal Cruz. We saw Fernando Tatis, who came up as a shortstop, get moved to the outfield and find a lot of success there. Uh, you know, he's got the arm to do it. And we've seen with Noelvi Marte that in the outfield, the arm strength means a lot more than the arm accuracy. And Ellie's got the arm strength to play in the outfield, but the arm accuracy at shortstop is really killer. Um, so, he's got the athleticism, the speed, I mean, he's 6'6". He could rob home runs without even jumping at Great American Ballpark. So, I think it's worth considering. And if Matt McLean is going to stick on this team, you know, play him at short and you play Gavin Lux or Sal Stewart at second base. And that sort of solves the infield logjam a little bit. You hope it helps Ellie out in the field. And, I just think at this point it needs to be seriously considered going into next year um, because the errors are getting to be a bit too much at shortstop for Ellie. And I think, the last thing for next year, this team needs to rethink base running and this base running strategy. This team has a lot of speed, and they're not really utilizing it when they get on base. Um, they're taking the extra bases when they're base hits or something like that, but they're not stealing bases and they're grounding into a lot of double plays because of it. So, I think, stealing also, you force the other team to make a play. The catcher has to make a good throw. The second baseman or shortstop has to stop that ball. Um, I think this is an overcorrection from the David Bell era. This team ran into quite a few outs, stealing bases in the David Bell era, but they need to steal more than they're doing right now. And then lastly, Sal Stewart got called up today with the roster expansion. He made his first start today at first base. He's only played like 3 career games at first base, so I think it was pretty wild to start him at first base in his first major league game. But, it ended up working out. He went 1 for 3 with a single and a run scored, which was pretty awesome to see. Um, he's pretty fired up after he scored that run, too. He said something to the dugout that I can't say on this podcast because we're a family podcast, but he was pretty fired up. And in his post game interview today, he said, I'm just fired up to be here. I wanted to fire the guys up. So seems like he's a team player and a good kid. I hope to see a lot of good things from him now that he's up here at the major league level. And the Reds are 1-0 in the Sal Stewart era. It's the Sal Stewart effect, people are calling it. I mean, Reds were up 2-1 going into the ninth. Emilio Pagan gives up 2 home runs back to back, a 2-run shot and then a solo shot, and Reds go down 4-2. And I turned the game off at that point. I was upset with Emilio Pagan and the Reds, and I was pretty tired of watching Reds baseball. And then in the bottom of the ninth, the Reds rallied back and walked it off. So maybe it's the South Stewart effect. Hopefully it is. Hopefully the Reds can get hot, go on a run here, and make a playoff push. But I think that's wishful thinking at this point. But that's all I have for my Red Legs. If we want to get into the fantasy baseball talk, and I'll let you start it off, Chris.
Yeah, so as we said in the beginning of the episode, Jaden and I are squaring off in round one of the playoffs. So this was so I'm the 4 seed in the league. I have a 17-5 record, and Jaden is the 5 seed in the league. So in our league, it's a 12 team league, and the top 6 teams make the quote unquote playoffs with the top two in each. So we have 2 divisions of 6 teams. So in each division, the division winner gets a bye, and then whatever seeds work out from there. So, um, uh, and then the tiebreakers with record are head to head. I think is the one that trumps the total points scored on the season. But yeah, so I could have had the 3 seed. I unfortunately made a bit of a tactical decision a few weeks ago where a tactical snafu where I started 9 I started 9 starters, and in our league you're allowed 12 starters. Um, but I was cruising to a pretty easy win, and it wasn't really going to move the needle for me if I had started all 12 of my starters. So I just kind of turned the app off for a few days and let my fantasy baseball team do its thing. But that turned out to be pretty costly because I was 44 points shy of getting the third seed. And Jaden's team has won 8 in a row, and they're red hot. My team was really hot for the middle of the season, and then they've kind of tailed off the last few weeks. I had a really good week last week, but I was kind of emptying the chamber to try to get that third seed. So unfortunately, came away with the 4 seed and have to face Jaden, but. Yeah, I finished third in the division, and right now, as it stands, I had a rough day in fantasy. So I had 4 starters go today. Just kind of how my rotation was, or the timing of it. I felt pretty good about my roster overall. Um, I did have a couple question marks. I did have Parker Messick on my fantasy team. He put up 2 really good starts for the Guardians, and I was decently confident in his ability. Nothing really in his first 2 starts raised a huge red flag for me, but unfortunately he was pretty shaky in the in his start today. The Red Sox hit him well. They made him work really hard, and unfortunately, he only got through 3 2/3 innings. So he put up 6 points for me, and then Brian Bayo wasn't much better. He was also on my fantasy team, and the Guardians played him tough today, which it's kind of I had 2 of my starters do really bad in that game, and the Guardians lost. So. That just was not a very ideal game for me in under any circumstances. Um, Hunter Green is also my fantasy team. He had a really good start today. He did his job, and then um, Jacob Mizorowski I still have on my team. He was really good on my team through like July, and then the league kind of started to figure him out. I was going to drop him after last week, but he actually put up a pretty good start. So I held on to him for the playoffs, and then he had a pretty pedestrian outing today. He had 4 1/3 innings pitched and 3 runs. So they also the Brewers pulled him at 73 pitches, so he's on an innings limit. And obviously he's coming off of that. I think it was a shin injury or something, but um, yeah, just not an ideal start for my fantasy team. Aroldis Chapman is on my team, and he got the save today. And Aroldis Chapman has been on a pretty generational run lately, as they say. But Aroldis Chapman's gonna be huge for me this week. I do have a couple relievers that I picked up on the team. Another semi mistake I made was I had Edward Cabrera go on my injured list, and then the Marlins game started at 105, and at 106, I moved Edward Cabrera to the IL and picked up Abner Uribe of the Brewers, who's a reliever. And unfortunately, Edward Cabrera was locked on my team. So I don't know how Uribe did today. I'll check that right now. But um,
Of
okay,
negative
he
1 point.
scored -1 point. So it didn't turn out to matter. So that mistake I made didn't really move the needle at all. But he did pitch, so that there is that. Um, but yeah, a bit of a rough start for me. I am in the lead by about 50 points, but you had how many starters did you have go today?
Only one.
One. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's not ideal. I would want with 4 starters, I've had 150 point days before. I only scored
Right.
84 points today, so that's really not ideal for my team. I'm gonna have to really figure something out going forward. I stocked up on relievers to try to pick up points here and there, but I just am not super confident in my team's ability to pull this one out. So and it's single elimination, so my season could be over.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely nervous, you know. The thing with our league and these playoffs is you and I and our other friend who finished first in our division, we've got a tough path to the playoffs because our division was the stronger division of the two. We had 4 teams make it compared to 2 out of the other division. And, you know, you or I, until we, and probably when we get to the championship, even, we'll have to play teams from our division. And so it's going to be tough. You know, you really wanted that 3 seed if you were someone in our division because you get to play the two teams from the other division that made the playoffs. And those are definitely the weaker two teams as it stands right now. Neither of those two teams have outscored any of the four teams that made the playoffs from our division. So, um, you know, kind of hurt you not getting that 3 seed. I
It
was
did,
never
yeah.
going to get it. I had a couple costly losses early on in the year, um, where I refused to sort of play the game that you had to play to win in our fantasy league with the starter rule. So, um, I'm kicking myself for that. But like you said, my team is on a 8 game winning streak. Um, Heading into this matchup now, granted winning streaks mean nothing in fantasy sports because these guys aren't in a clubhouse. There is no actual momentum. But maybe there's a little bit of artificial momentum. I think, my lineup needs to be the difference this week. And, hitters don't score a lot in this league, but when my lineup goes well, I seem to do well and the pitching staff can, not matter as much. So it's really going to come down to how my lineup performs, I think. Um, I did pick up Noah McLean, and I'm hoping that, he's pitched really well to start his career, but I'm sort of thinking that as a baseball analysis sort of train of thought, I'm thinking that it's just because the league hasn't figured him out. They don't have good scouting reports on him yet. So, my hope is that he can stay ahead of the league for like 2 more weeks while I use him in the playoffs. But I think eventually he's going to get figured out, and I'm going to have to. Hopefully, that just happens um, after the fantasy playoffs are done. I picked up a guy who started for me today. It was a guy I'd never heard of for the Athletics named Luis Morales, and he's made a couple starts in the big leagues. But he put up 27 points for me today, pitched 5.2 innings with 8 strikeouts, 2 earned runs, and he picked up the win. So that was huge for me. Sort of took a flyer on him, and it paid off in a big way. That was a big points getter. Um, I had to think today who are, you know, you're doing that reliever strategy and eating some eating
Some
some points from
starters.
starters, yeah.
Yeah.
And I had to think today who are starters that I am not going to drop. I think I have 4 guys on my team who are undroppable at this point because they're such big points getters for me. Um, so I'll have to see how it shakes out towards the end of this week, but I could definitely see myself just stocking up on relievers to try and scratch out some points if it's close at the end of the week.
Yeah, the thing with my team is that I'm still scheduled to have all my starters. I'm scheduled to have all starters go with the current way my roster is constructed. I just have guys that are not going to pitch later on
Right.
who I'm just going to sub for relievers, and hopefully they could pick up those points that were sacrificed from just bad starts
Yeah.
from the guys that I was trusting on. And Parker Messick is one of those guys. Like Luis Morales, the guy from the Athletics who you picked up. Parker Messick put up a 33-point start for me last week, which I was hoping for that to carry into this start against Boston, but like I said,
Mhm.
unfortunately that didn't happen. So
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I don't have anything else on the fantasy side of things. Do you have anything else, Chris?
I don't think so. It's gonna be I think that I don't want to uh, get ahead of myself here, but I think that one of the two of us, whoever wins this 4-5 matchup, I think one of the two of us is going to go to the finals.
Yeah.
I don't know because it's tough. I think it go I think go either way actually because
it's
the our one seed has a really good team. Um, and yeah, it's a really, really tough road to the finals in our side of the bracket. So me
definitely.
not me sacrificing those 44 points or whatever I had between me and the 3 seed was really, really costly for me. And I think I'm gonna end up regretting that however things shape up. So
Yeah. You definitely wanted that 3 seed.
Yeah.
It's a cakewalk to the championship, really.
Yeah, it is.
Um, and the thing is,
I'm 3-1 against the
right?
guys in the other bracket. So
Yeah, yeah, it's tough. But we will update you on how our fantasy matchup went and
for
how
sure.
the Reds and Guardians did this upcoming week when we talk to you next week. Thanks so much for joining us for episode 32, and we will see you next week.
Thank you.